Okay, everybody, let's talk about the Renaissance and what it actually is, what it means, and how it got started here in Europe. This will be the first mini unit that we study as part of our bigger study of the Unit 1 from about 1450 to 1648. So first off, Renaissance, what is it? Renaissance, being a Latin term, literally means rebirth, but they weren't calling this period the Renaissance back in, the 1400s. The term Renaissance did actually not exist until the 1800s, right? I don't get it either. It's okay. Who knows? There was a 19th century historian by the name of Jacob Burckhardt. This guy right here, looking at the University of Berlin, he did a lot of study in terms of history of the Middle Ages compared to that period of the 1500s, and he's kind of trying to figure out. He wrote this book in 1860 called "Civilization in the Renaissance of Italy," and essentially he said that there was this time period from about mid 1300s to 1550s that was in direct contrast to the Middle Ages. Remember, the Middle Ages, also known as the Dark Ages, was this time where nothing really advanced. Okay, you had no politics, you had feudalism, you had no learning, all that kind of stuff. Decline of culture, brutal wars, all those kind of things going on. Here he says, look, we have this time period now where it's the exact opposite. We have the time period where we have advances in politics, advances art, the idea of humanism, which we'll talk about more next week, the development of culture, all those kind of things happening. And that is a direct contrast to those Middle Ages. And that's how this term gets coined. This is something we will talk about on Friday in class in terms of Burckhardt. Now, why is it important? Traditionally, and according to some historians, traditionally the Renaissance has been the dividing line, if you will, between medieval Europe and modern Europe. We think modern is being now. Well, modern Europe starts around the 1400s. And it's that major shift in belief. The idea we go from no learning, church ruled everything, to not. We have new thoughts, new feelings, we have new philosophy, the development of literature, the change in religion. Think about the idea of the Protestant Revolution, development of better art and technology, change in politics, questioning moral and civic ideas. All these big changes happening. The biggest idea is the change to a secular attitude. That word secular meaning not church related. And so we start seeing things, at least in the view of Renaissance historians who believe in the idea of a Renaissance. We'll talk about this later on. There's other views on it too, okay? But that now things become less church related. So remember, real quick, we talked about this last time. The church. There's this big question pre 1400s. Who should control the church? The Pope or people? Remember, the church controlled most of daily life at this time in Europe. I mean, they were the largest landowners of Europe. They had the largest government, that being the College of Cardinals. There's a separate legal system just for the clerics. So if I'm a priest or a cleric, a member of the church, and I do something wrong, I don't go to the regular court. I go to the special court. Okay? The church makes their own taxes. There's a lot of questions people make about the church's tax. And remember, there's this big church crisis. And just a quick remembering from, what's going on here. But before this era of Renaissance, or in the very start of this era of Renaissance, you have the different movements of no taxes for clerics, the clericis laicios. You have the unum sanctum, the idea that, the Pope is the head of the church, people need to follow him. You have these conflicting ideas here that people aren't so happy with. And you have that Babylonian captivity. The church starts doing things as well in response to the secularism of the time. Things, guys like Wycliffe and Huss and all that kind of stuff, they go to the Inquisition, where you start, hunting out people who are against the church and, burning them at the stake, etc. Trying to find the unbelievers, heathens, etc., if you will, and find them, okay? The Renaissance popes, the popes during this time, were free spending and weren't exactly religious. We'll talk more of this later on in terms of the humanism. But the Renaissance popes like spending money. There are popes that literally spent the entire church bank account multiple times. And trust me, some of the popes in religious time did not act very religious. We're talking, fathering children out of wedlock when you shouldn't be wed in the first place. Bribery, murder, all that kind of stuff was happening at this time. In terms of the Pope, and it's kind of those questions of people start questioning those church trends. So the Renaissance begins in Italy, okay, and begins around 1300, lasts till mid 16th century in Italy. Typically, it's really focused on high culture. We'll talk about this social mix in a second here, okay? But really, only a few people were really kind of influencing in this Renaissance, just the upper cultures. We'll talk about how it influenced the lower cultures later on too, okay? Art made a big difference here, and art really did expand the Renaissance from the high upper class to everybody. We do have Northern Europe where it does spread. So it starts in Italy and very, 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 very slowly does spread up into Europe and Britain. So we're not seeing this stuff in England until the 16th and 17th centuries. We're actually seeing this stuff happen in England. And the question is, why does that movement happen? Well, somewhere to talk about in class. So why does it start in Italy, you think, and go to the north? Now, where the really big political change, and we're focused on politics first here, is in the Italian city-states. So here we have Italy. Italy is not Italy at this point. Italy is a whole bunch of little city-states based around the city that they're center of it and the land around it. So you have all these different places like Milan and Venice and Genoa, ruled by these men named signore, okay, or the despots or oligarchies, essentially ruled by these merchant aristocracies. Because the merchant of the time became more important now than the king. The merchant started making money. The commenda, the merchant and merchant adventurers who started to take all these risks with their money. They would invest in explorers and trade and put all this money down for trade with the East, and they got rich in Italy this way. And if you were rich, it gave you a chance to be powerful. And Italy became more and more urban as we see merchants kind of taking more and more charge of the politics of Italy. And so really see the city-states become a bigger and bigger thing over time here. Now, here's the thing. Italy is not one country. And so these city-states fight each other nonstop. The weaker ones ally together, fight against the bigger one. And you have these little cities, you don't have really big armies. So these guys would do is they would hire condottieri, or essentially mercenary armies. They hired mercenaries and generals, that kind of stuff, to fight each other. So I'm gonna go back a slide here. You have you'd have Venice fighting other cities. You'd have Milan fighting Venice, back and forth, back and forth. These minor states where the pink is here, they'd all band together and fight against one of the big ones, and vice versa. And they fought a lot. Every single year, I would say they were fighting wars. And really, you think with long term, the political disunity, because they couldn't work together, it really leads to their downfall. Just for the record here, Italy is not a country, an actual country, until the 1870s. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen in Italy here as their downfall goes. Really, they fought each other until 1454, a peace settlement called the Peace of Lodi. Not Lodi, east of us, but it was essentially a peace happened for 40 years. But you had these armies that were set for fighting for 150 years. Essentially, you have armies fighting. Look at see what kind of people they have. It's a cool little thing. You have pikemen, you have handgunners. So you do have musketeers. You do have gunpowder at this point as well. And so the armies are getting more and more modern. So we'll go through some major city-states and figures here. So Florence was by far the most powerful, being led by guild members. The guilds in terms of trade and merchant guilds. And Medici's were by far the most powerful, with Lorenzo Medici being the biggest patron of the arts. One of the things, if you were a rich guy, you could afford art. Art was the Lamborghini, if you will, of the 1400s. And so the Medici's, these guys right here, I believe these three are all Medici's right here, were really involved in banking, involved in textiles, because they got rich. and so they would commission all these works of art from the great Renaissance master artists and painters and sculptors in order to decorate their home, and that was their sign of prominence, was that they had all this art in their house. It was the mansion, it was the Lamborghini, it was the private helicopter, okay, and toilet made of gold. It was art, and that's what you had to have. So Florence, very very powerful this time, led by the Medici's. They fought a lot against the Duchy of Milan, led by the Sforza family, who fought against Venice and Florence. And really, the Sforzas are kind of called some of the troublemakers of Europe. They made their powerful life through trade, though eventually they would eventually kind of calm down with the Peace of Lodi. But the Sforzas, here's the head Sforza man right here, were kind of the big troublemakers of Europe, if you will. Rome is also very, very powerful this time, okay? So Rome, in the papal states around Rome, the Pope is not only a religious leader, but he is also a civic leader as well. Pope Alexander VI is by far the height of corruption. He was a member of the Borgia family. He had fathered multiple children. He had a whole list of stuff here. His daughter, Lucretia Borgia, he basically pimped her out to get more power. All that kind of stuff was going on here. That was one of the big things about the Pope this time, that they were very, very corrupt. You had the warrior Pope, Julius II, this guy over here, who actually physically led armies himself against other places, but also sponsored art. I mean, Rome at this time was the lap of luxury, okay? When they were rebuilding Rome from the burnings, all kinds of stuff that happened earlier, they didn't address the main problems, but they invested in art and they invested in luxury, in mansions, in the Sistine Chapel, all that kind of stuff. And so they spent tons of money on nothing but artwork, and they actually drained the church coffers 2 or 3 times because they're buying art. You have Venice. So Venice, obviously, is in northern Italy, famous for its canals, huge trading city. Now it's sinking, but whatever. It was an oligarchy led by some of the biggest members of that. They had a Senate merchant kind of thing called the Doge, and the Doge, who was kind of the head of the council of Senate merchants. And the Doge had this gorgeous palace. If you want to see a good example, in Madison Capital, the governor's conference room is meant to replicate the Doge's palace. You had a registry, which got you on the citizenship, which meant you had full rights in that city. So it's really kind of a unique oligarchy, and it actually lasted to the 1800s, where they had a lot of power. But because they're built on this water-based city, lots of navy power, lots of trade, lots of money, and that's how you got powerful at this time. You do have two Naples to two Sicilies. Were the only city-state to have a king, if you will, but they're considered to be backwards. They weren't as powerful, weren't as didn't have as much power as other places. In fact, most of southern Italy at this time is still pretty agricultural, still pretty rural, and actually controlled by Spain and France, if that makes sense. So really, they didn't have a lot going on, southern France, if you will, southern Italy at this time. Excuse me. One big figure we'll talk about in class, and we'll do some reading on, is a guy named Machiavelli. Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince. He wrote this in the 1400s. He was an advisor to the second run of Medici's in Florence. Essentially, he was an advisor, had gotten fired, and wrote this book to get back as the guy who fired him's kid took over, trying to get his job back. He spent a lot of time with the French kings, and he wrote this book essentially as a guidebook to being a prince. And essentially, how do you rule and keep a kingdom, but not ruling by Christian principles? And basically said you can rule any way you have to, and had all these nice little lines about what a prince needs to be. We're going to really focus on this and see how the political changes happen in Europe at this time. Eventually, these things start falling apart. France starts invading. And actually the different city-states started working with other people, if you will, okay? And so what happened was, in 1494, Ludovico, Milan's leader, encouraged Charles VIII, who was king of Holy Roman Empire and all those areas up north and France, to invade Naples and to invade their enemies. Well, that started French kind of saying, hey, well, I invaded one state, let's start taking more and more and more and more and more and more and more. Eventually, Florence tried to appease them and led to overthrow the Medici's, where they come back around the time of Machiavelli. But cities eventually fall apart because they're not very powerful. They're small, and these other bigger countries can roll in and take them over. You even have, political issues like Geronimo Savonarola, who actually tried getting rid of corruption in Florence by making a theocracy where he had these huge fires, and blamed paganism and moral decline. And